The narrative lectionary today has us looking at the parables of Jesus as found in the Gospel of Mark. And the parables themselves are mostly about seeds. There are seeds that are scattered on different soils, seeds growing regardless of what the farmer does, small seeds that become big plants. And yes, there's even a short parable about how people put a lamp on a lampstand and not under a basket. And maybe if I'd grown up a country boy in Nazareth in the beginning of the first century, maybe then these parables would have resonated with me. But I didn't. I grew up a city boy in the Midwestern U.S. at the end of the 20th century. So like a good Gen Xer, I'm drawn to the part we just heard, where Jesus says he is teaching in order that people won't understand, in order that people won't turn their lives around, in order that they won't be forgiven. I mean, what do we make of that? And admittedly, how you answer that question will depend on how you see Jesus, including whether or not you see these words as representative of the historical Jesus, or rather the person who wrote this gospel. And for convention's sake, I'm going to call that person Mark. No relation, by the way. But that line is actually a quote from the prophet Isaiah. It's from one of the best-known passages in the book of Isaiah, in the 6th chapter, when the prophet receives his commissioning. And it's this totally vibrant scene where Isaiah has a vision taking him to the very throne room of God. There are angels, they're seraphim, with 6 wings. They're flying around and they're shouting, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." The room is shaking and full of smoke. Isaiah cries out that he has unclean lips. And then an angel goes and picks a live coal and comes and cleanses his lips with that live coal. Then the booming voice of God says, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah boldly replies, "Here am I, send me." And that's the point where we normally stop that story. We turn it into a song. We treat that statement as the great statement of faith in that commissioning story. But in my opinion, the real statement of faith from Isaiah is coming later. Because what happens next is God gives Isaiah the message to give to the people of Judah. And that's where we get the words that Mark's gospel loosely quotes. God says that this message is so that the people of Judah will listen intently but don't understand, look carefully but don't comprehend, so they cannot see with their eyes or hear with their ears, so they cannot understand with their minds and turn and be healed. It's a troubling message. But what we don't see in Mark's reference to it is what comes immediately after that. And that is, immediately after that, Isaiah challenges and questions that message. He says, "How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord?" And that question, and others like it, and really that act of questioning, that was a common thing in Hebrew Scripture. I mean, it's what happens when Abraham haggles with God over the lives of people in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the complaining that we find in seemingly half of the Psalms. It's the entire book of Habakkuk. There's this rich tradition in Hebrew Scripture where the prophetic struggle with God is every bit as important as the prophetic message to the masses. So Isaiah asks, "How long?" And that question, that willingness to argue on behalf of those left out, that is Isaiah's real statement of faith in his commissioning story. And then God, as God often does in these exchanges, God then gives a slightly changed reply. Now, it's still an answer that is mainly one of devastation. It's still a troubling message explaining the troubling future of Judah. But this time, the message ends with a simple and vivid picture. God describes an oak tree that is cut down to its stump and then says, "Its stump is a holy seed." Its stump is a holy seed. And while commentators dispute the exact meaning of that line, all agree that it is meant as an image of hope. And at that point, precisely because Isaiah has engaged in this prophetic struggle with God, we get a new understanding of the divine. And really, that is what the Gospel of Mark is all about. It's about this vibrant, excited, overwhelming, and at times confusing encounter with the divine as found in the life of Jesus. It's a divine encounter that is meant to give us new understanding. And the gospel writer clearly knows this. In fact, one of the dead giveaways is that immediately after declaring that Jesus spoke in parables so people wouldn't understand, Mark then has Jesus explain exactly what he meant by the parable. Yes, Jesus is telling his disciples about it, but Mark is telling the whole world. The gospel writer isn't trying to deny understanding. He's trying to create new understanding, new news, good news, gospel. So this verse about understanding and turning and forgiveness, it is at the heart of the gospel message. But too often we only focus on the last two parts, the part about turning lives around, the part about being forgiven. Yes, the gospel does include those two things, and thankfully. But there's this third critical element of the gospel message that is about understanding, specifically about creating new understanding. And that's why we have all these images of seeds growing, of a light shining forth into the darkness. It's to create understanding. Now notice Jesus doesn't try to control that understanding, control that creation. He leaves that to the work of the Spirit. And it may not be an understanding that you can ever fully really explain. I mean, there's a reason why these things come in parables. But the whole life of Christ, as found in Mark, screams for a new understanding of God. And that means that if we claim to be disciples of Christ, we too should follow that lead. We too should do things that can create new understanding. Like Jesus, we leave the actual creation of understanding to the work of the Spirit. But we can do those small things that sow seeds. So we need to do things like ask questions that we don't know the answers to be the voice in otherwise familiar conversations that refuses to say the same banal things over and over and over. We need to create art, even if we're not artistically creative. We need to serve people we would ignore, to cross boundaries and discover that children of God are everywhere. We need to keep listening to people we don't agree with, and we need to keep, or maybe start praying for people that we don't like. We need to do these things and other things because they create new understanding. And if for nobody else, they create new understanding for ourselves. The heart of the gospel is about embracing this vibrant and exciting and overwhelming and at times confusing process of creating understanding, a process that, like Isaiah, we call being in the presence of God. Now, I suspect that most of you have at some point experienced this process, and maybe at various points. And for me, one of those certainly happened in the 2 years that I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the beautiful country of El Salvador. I was assigned to a small village called Canoas. And in many ways, Canoas was a contemporary version of the Nazareth of Jesus' day. And it's not something I realized while I was there. It wasn't until I got back and I was actually sitting in a sermon in a Methodist church, and I heard the pastor describing Nazareth in Jesus' day, and I was shocked because she was describing the Canoas that I knew. Because like Nazareth, Canoas was a village of about 400 people, 70 homes, where most of the people belonged to just a handful of families. Like Nazareth, Canoas was mainly a community of subsistence farmers in this region of hills and cliffs with limited access to water. Like Nazareth, Canoas was seen as insignificant even in its own small country, and that was a country dominated politically and militarily and economically by a powerful empire. And the most talented and ambitious people would leave for places with more opportunity. And even though this was the 21st century, it was the very start of the 21st century, and not the first century, Canoas didn't have electricity. So people used candles or small lamps to light their homes. So in that context, when I read Jesus talk about the importance of the flame from a candle or a lamp, or maybe a flashlight, it gave me this whole new understanding of how different you feel in your very house with that small light, of being able to do things like get ready for the day, or clean up in the evening, or stay safe at night. And even though this was the 21st century, all the farmers in Canoas went out to work their fields by hand. And these were very limited fields, often on the sides of hills or cliffs, and usually a long walk from where that person lived. And before living in Canoas, when I read Jesus tell of a farmer going out to scatter seed, it sounded like the most peaceful and idyllic work, like somebody simply going for a pleasant walk and throwing out some seed as they go. Yet after living in Canoas, I can say that farming by hand could never be mistaken for light and carefree work. In fact, I literally have a scar on my hand from the first time I tried it. But honestly, when I say that my time in Canoas gave me a new understanding, I'm not really talking about an appreciation for farming or candlelight. No, I'm talking about having new perspective and new perspectives that changed how I see the world, of how I value life, of how I experience God. And probably the most meaningful way I can describe that is by telling you about some of the people in Canoas who changed that understanding for me. I could tell you about my good friend Miguel, so full of life. He had this joyous and contagious, mischievous laugh. And Miguel was 18 years old when I got to Canoas, and one of 11 children in a family that in many ways became like a second family to me. And they showed me hospitality that would make most of us feel ashamed. And partially because of some likely undiagnosed learning issues, and partially because of a limited school system, Miguel never made it past the 2nd grade. Honestly, though, Miguel had never gone to school for more than the first week or so of the year anyway, because he would instead go work in the field with his father and brothers. He's one of the hardest working people I know, and one of the only people I know who genuinely makes an effort to get along with everyone. Or I would tell you about Don Eduardo. And Eduardo was an 83-year-old man who lived in poor conditions even by the standards of Canoas. And this was a community where nearly all the houses were made of earth. But Eduardo, he didn't even have a string hammock, which pretty much every house seemed to have. Instead, his hammock was made from a burlap sack that was cut open. And whenever I would show up at his house to visit him, he would immediately offer me that burlap hammock, and then he would go sit on a stump that he used for a chair. Yet I never once sensed any worry or discontent in Eduardo. And as I would sit and talk to him, he had this presence and personality where all of my discontent would fade away. Or I could talk about Milagro, whose family also showed me deep hospitality and friendship. Milagro is one of 4 dedicated students in an English class I had, and she had this clearly brilliant and inquisitive mind and a tenacious personality that couldn't be hidden no matter how humble she was. Milagro is one of those people I knew would not spend her whole life in Canoas. In fact, none of those 3 people are still in Canoas. Miguel would find that due to economic changes in his country and in the world, the farming that had been practiced for centuries no longer provided even basic subsistence. And so he, like many Salvadorans, would eventually have to leave his own country to find work. Don Eduardo died about a month after I said goodbye and left. And I remember getting that news in a handwritten letter from his daughter-in-law a couple weeks after the fact. And I gotta say, there's something about a letter that was written a few weeks before, mailed from another part of the world, telling you about the death of someone you care about, that seems like a completely different world from the one we live in today. And finally, Milagro. Milagro would see her family greatly affected by the organized crime that grips much of El Salvador. And this included the brutal murder of her father on the very path in Canoas that I used to walk every day. But Milagro would also go all the way through school, and that was a rarity in Canoas because the local school only went up through 5th grade. So it meant she had to travel, and it meant working difficult jobs to pay for it while doing so. Yet she worked herself all the way through school, all the way through college, to become a lawyer. And she remained in El Salvador, where today she works on behalf of individuals and families who have limited resources or those who have been made vulnerable by the very systems that are supposed to protect them. And these were just some of the people in Canoas who changed my understanding of the world and of God. They were gospel to me. Isaiah signified the divine with flying angels and smoke-filling throne rooms. The writer Mark had the compelling life of Christ and teaching that came in parables. As for me, I feel the joyousness of Miguel and the contentment of Don Eduardo and the tenacity of Milagro. And when I do, I am in the very presence of God.